see you fasten your seatbelt here, getting ready for the action. Why don't you give us an opening statement, reading, and then we'll start grilling you.
Well, first off, thank you for such a wonderful, warm welcome. Karen and I are delighted to be back in Utah. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And I too want to thank our great friends Scott and Karen Keller for helping to make today possible, as was everyone else that's made time to be here today. And I will tell you, I was governor of Indiana when Governor Gary Herbert was leading Utah in such distinction, and I must tell you, I really did not enjoy competing with Governor Gary Herbert for jobs. But we see that you're making, through the Herbert Institute, you're making just as great a difference in the life of the great state of Utah as you did in public life. Join me in thanking Governor Gary Herbert and his incredible I'm really delighted to be with you, and I know this is a challenging time in the life of our nation. But when I think about what we were able to accomplish with the support of the people of Utah over 4 years of the Trump-Pence administration, I know that with the right leadership at the national level at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, with the right leadership in state houses around the country, the best days for the greatest nation on earth are yet to come. We just have to return to right principles in America. In a short period of time during the Trump-Pence administration, we rebuilt our military, we revived our economy by cutting taxes, rolling back regulations, unleashed American energy. We became a net energy exporter for the first time in 75 years. We became energy independent. We reduced illegal immigration at our southern border by 90%. We appointed conservatives who stood up for religious liberty and the sanctity of life to our Supreme Court of the United States of America. And before that pandemic struck, all of our nation and America prospered. And how times have changed for all of us. And that period before the pandemic of prosperity and security and of peace on the world stage has given way to the leadership under President Joe Biden that has literally weakened America at home and abroad. Whether it was a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that emboldened the enemies of freedom around the world, whether it be policies at home that unleashed the worst border crisis in history, that a gusher of spending that launched the worst inflation in 40 years, a crime wave in many of our major cities, and a war on energy here in Utah and around the country that's driven up the prices of energy and made us dependent again on some of the most volatile places in the world for our energy needs. But I'm here to tell you, hope is on the way. I truly do believe we are 18 months away from a great American comeback, and it'll start right here. So thank you all very much, and I look forward, Governor, to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President. We are honored to have you here. As we've already explained, you've had great experience, you know, as 12 years in Congress, Governor of Indiana, a challenging time for the Vice President, and tell us what you've learned from that experience. What experience can you share with us, and what lessons learned?
Well, it was a great privilege for me to serve. It would be important for me to acknowledge at the outset that I did not serve alone. I was married now for 37 years to a Marine Corps mom, a 30-year elementary school teacher, an accomplished artist, and the proud grandmother of 3 granddaughters under the age of 2. Would you join me in giving a warm welcome to the greatest second lady of the United States of America? As you may be able to grab a copy of my book on your way out. I don't know if I mentioned I wrote a book here.
I don't know if it's common knowledge or not, but we have a few of them around here. By the way, don't rush. On your way out, one book per household. We have one for everybody.
I'd be honored if anyone took a look at the book. It really is less a story about us as it is a story, I believe, about God's faithfulness in our lives. and lessons learned along the way. As you would read in the pages of my memoir, we tried our hand at politics, Gary. You may not even know this, when Ronald Reagan was still in the White House. 1988. I was 29 years old, jet black hair, okay, thinner. Karen didn't look any different, to be honest with you. See the pictures. But we ran for Congress not once, but twice, and frankly, we got caught up in the kind of negative politics that we've gotten used to in America these days. But in the aftermath of that, I was reflecting on my values, the decision I'd made to put my faith in Jesus Christ as a freshman in college, and I came to conclude that I hadn't squared what my faith required of me with my politics. And so 10 years later, when the opportunity came back around, we just determined we were going to run campaigns that honored God, informed the debate, and then were about winning. And with my wife at my side, we were elected to Congress in the year 2000. We were elected governor of Indiana 12 years later, and then it was my great honor to be elected 48th Vice President of the United States. And let me just say to the people of Utah, thank you for your support during that season of service. Serving as your Vice President was the greatest honor of my life, and will always be grateful. But throughout that time, I literally was able to take a journey through, in many ways, what our founders envisioned in the American government, which is a government that has a legislative branch. It is a government that has an executive branch, both branches in which I had the privilege to serve. But just as important, and I would say of equal importance, which you would say as well, Governor Herbert, is that serving as a governor, I understood the genius of federalism in America, of what you've been able to do here in Utah, what we've done in the state of Indiana, the contrast between states led by Republican governors to this day in America, and the failed policies of big government liberal Democrat governors in states around the country. It's a testament to states as those laboratories of innovation and reform. And I love what Ronald Reagan said in his first inaugural address. And it's important to remember that the states created the federal government didn't create the states. And I learned that the key and the cure for what ails America is to return to those first principles, to put into practice what's enshrined in our Constitution, our founding documents, not only to return fiscal responsibility and strength to the national government, but to restore our commitment to federalism and state-based innovation and reform as a pathway to real. I know you agree with that.
Absolutely. I agree with a lot of what you said. I appreciate you recognizing Karen, and I recognize Jeanette, and it reminds me of an old adage: behind every successful man, there's a surprise mother-in-law. You've talked about what you've learned. Tell me, in your journey, what do you think today are the toughest challenges facing America?
Well, I do believe that the greatest challenge facing the United States in the world today is the rise of China. And China is today the greatest strategic and economic threat to the vitality and future of the United States. Here at home, I will say, as our economy is struggling under the weight of the failed policies of the Biden administration, it's easy for some people to forget that we have a national debt today the size of our nation's economy. For the first time since the end of World War II, we owe as much as the entire size of our economy. And the worst news is that left unchecked, left unreformed, what many of the policy leaders here already know, is that according to the Congressional Budget Office, that national debt will grow from $30 trillion to $150 trillion. And by the time our three perfect granddaughters are in their 20s, the United States of America could be facing a debt crisis the likes of which the world has never known. And if we don't meet that moment now with common sense and compassionate reform, they'll be left with only bad choices. either cutting programs that people depend on, or, by most estimates, doubling middle-class taxes and introducing a European-style taxation system known as a VAT. And the numbers just add up that way. And I really do believe that facing down China, being straight with the American people about the national debt crisis and bringing real leadership, saying to Americans that have the same color hair as me, this isn't about you. If you're retired today, we're not touching Social Security for you at all. And if you're going to retire in the next 25 years, it doesn't affect you either. But to say to younger Americans under the age of 40, we can bring common sense reforms that will ensure the vitality of these programs and set our nation back on a pathway of fiscal solvency, I believe is an idea whose time has come. It just takes American leadership. And finally, I believe that there's a hunger in this country to restore civility to our public debate. I think the American people, look, our politics is more divided today than any time in my lifetime, but I'm not convinced the American people are as divided as our politics. I mean, the truth is, as I said, we moved back to Indiana, thanks for mentioning it. We bought 5 acres and a pond. I got a riding mower, got a Ford Ranger. We're just back home again in Indiana. I tell people sometimes, you get 15 miles out of Washington, D.C., people in this country actually get along pretty well. American people are inherently kind and respectful to one another. That's not characterized in our politics these days. But I believe that democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. And I think in addition to standing up American strength on the world stage, dealing with our economy and a debt crisis here at home, I think the American people want to see us restore a threshold of civility and respect in public life once again. I'm
glad you brought that last one up. I'm going to give you a quote that you heard during the vice presidential debates, 6 years ago. This is from an 8th grade student from Springville Junior High School. She asked, and this is a quote, "When I watch the news, all I see is arguing between Democrats and Republicans. When I watch the news, all I see is citizens fighting against citizens. When I watch the news, all I see are 2 candidates from opposing parties trying to tear each other down. If our leaders can't get along, how are the citizens supposed to get along? Your examples could make all the difference to bring us together." I think many people long for what we thought were the idyllic years of Reagan and Tip O'Neill. They would meet together on a weekly basis and say, what can we do today?
Sure.
What will you do? What can you do? What should be done to bring us together and not have so much divisiveness and backbiting?
Well, I remember that quote. And I remember smiling then, and I smiled again. From the mouths of babes comes wisdom. I've often said to people, I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. In my memoir, I don't know if I mentioned I wrote a book. But in my memoir, I actually recount how when Karen and I went on this journey to just try to really treat others the way we want to be treated. That's at the very heart of my faith. And I know the faith of so many people in this room. It's love God and love our neighbors. But we tried to do that, and so during my years in Congress, as I write in the book, I developed relationships, good relationships, with people that I agreed with on nothing. I think of the late John Lewis, who was an aide-de-camp. I see an old colleague in the room. John Lewis was an aide-de-camp to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was beaten on Bloody Sunday within an inch of his life. He was an incredible American. And he was a man of profound faith. And it was on our shared pride in the progress that we've made toward a more perfect union, and on our shared faith that we became friends. I thought John Lewis was wrong about everything, except that he was a great man, and that this was a great country. And I'll never forget the day that he came into my office and he asked if I would co-lead the annual pilgrimage to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to mark the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And I said, I'll do it, but on one condition. And that was that Karen and I could bring our son Michael and daughter Charlotte and daughter Audrey with us. I wanted them to walk that bridge. I wanted them to experience that. I wanted them to know how far in their parents' lifetime America had come toward a more perfect union. Now, John and I would go on to disagree always. I think if you saw Mike Pence's vote on the board in the House of Representatives, you could assume if I was green, he was red. If I was red, he was green. But we had the ability to forge a relationship that was above that. You know, I've often said to people, I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. And I think that's how most Americans live. The challenge we have today, I believe, is to have government as good as our people. Government that's as idealistic, government that's as innovative, government that's as creative, but also government that's as respectful to one another as the American people are just about every day. But I think it's about leading by example. And whatever the future holds for us, we'll always aspire to that example. So help me God.
Thank you. Now, you've talked about an issue that's really I'm passionate about, and that's being fiscally prudent. Utah, one of only about 10 states that has a AAA bond rating from all the rating agencies on Wall Street.
That's not the first time you've mentioned that.
It's part of our culture. You ought not to spend more than you take in.
And what's one of the other states?
Indiana.
Thank you.
That's why I like you so much.
That's why I like you.
We've got to get back to some kind of fiscal restraint and not spend more than we take in and have rational debt and save for a rainy day. That's kind of what everybody here in the room does, in their families or in their businesses. What can we do to, in fact, make that a combined effort? I expect that most on the other side of the aisle would say, yeah, we got to balance our budget. We got to have. Bill Clinton brags about the last time it was balanced was he was president. What can you do to help that to happen?
Well, you balanced budgets when you were governor. Utah continues to lead on fiscal responsibility. I balanced budgets when I was governor. It just takes, you have to just make decisions. There's great leaders in the legislature in the room. It's about priorities. And I want to concede the fact that other than what we did to get the economy moving and rebuild our military, and other than what we did for families and businesses in the worst pandemic in 100 years, I don't think our administration did everything we needed to do to restrain federal spending. And so first it begins with having leadership at the highest level and leadership in the Congress that will roll their sleeves up and do the hard work. Now, civility plays into part of that. You and I both know that. I mean, you and I often reflect warmly on a couple of Irishmen, one of which was president, one of which was Speaker of the House back in the 1980s. And literally, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan fought like cats publicly, said how wrong each other were on everything. But they sat down, they rolled their sleeves up, they figured it out, and they actually extended the life of Social Security by 30 years through a common sense, compassionate reform. And set our nation back on the longest period of peacetime growth since World War II. And so I do believe the civility is part of it. You've got to create conditions where you can talk. But I think at the end of the day, we have to have leadership. I think of what General Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said about 10 years ago. He was sitting in a congressional committee and he was asked, what's the greatest threat to the United States in the 21st century? And his answer was the national debt. And that's when the national debt was a third of what it is today. Because when we talk about making the case for fiscal responsibility, providing for the common defense is the first object of the federal government. Today, entitlement spending is 70% of our federal budget, and add interest is even beyond that. And it continues to grow and crowd out the resources that we have to meet our obligations to defend this nation and to stand with our treaty allies around the world. So I think it's all about leadership. I think it's all about you've got to take the case to the American people that we have to have balanced budgets, not just for growth, not just because it's the right thing to do, because it gives us the ability to defend our nation and support those programs upon which the American people rely.
Thank you. Another issue that's in the press all the time, it seems to be a hot button issue, we can't seem to figure out how to resolve: immigration. And I'm talking about people that come to our country from outside our borders, overstay visas, and we know the challenge we've had at the borders. But the gate never is talked about. We talk about walls and fences, we don't talk about the gate. We've had this issue since Ronald Reagan, and it doesn't look like to me we're any closer to having a solution we had back in the 80s. So what would you do for immigration reform?
Vote Republican. You can clap for that if you want. I don't think. It all begins with border security. I think our administration brought into the public debate a recognition that border security is national security. And so not only the construction of a wall, but a Remain in Mexico agreement that I negotiated on the president's behalf with a Mexican delegation that required people to wait in Mexico while their asylum application was being processed, and literally reduced illegal immigration and asylum abuse by 90%. We had secured our border, and I tremble when I realize that Title 42, which was another part of our policy, is about to go away under the Biden administration. Literally day one, President Joe Biden ceased construction of the wall, let literally girders of infrastructure rust in the sunshine in Arizona. I've stood next to them. It looks like a freight train as far as you can see of girders laid on top of each other with enormous gaps in the wall. He ended or sought to end the Remain in Mexico policy. Now Title 42 is about to go away. And because of that, 5 million people came into this country illegally in the first 2 years of this administration. It's utterly unsustainable. And so it begins with recognizing that a nation without borders is not a nation. We have to produce national leadership that will accept the responsibility to secure the southern border of the United States of America. That's first. Secondly, my grandfather immigrated to this country from Ireland, 1923. Got off a boat on Ellis Island, took a train to Chicago, Illinois, drove a bus in Chicago, Illinois for 40 years. My first visit to the Oval Office during the Bush administration, I mentioned my grandfather because we were there talking about immigration. And I remember telling President Bush, I said, Richard Michael Cawley getting off that boat on Ellis Island is how Richard Pence got to the Oval Office to meet the President of the United States. That was before I was ever governor or ever held the title that you all gave me the privilege to hold. I mean, this is the land of opportunity, and the truth of the matter is that system that my grandfather came through, there's some in this room come through, is truly broken. And I would tell you that I believe the time has come for a merit-based immigration system where we overhaul immigration in this country, we streamline it, we put the interests of our states, our economies, our industries in the country first, and we fix that broken door. You're absolutely right, Gary. I love, again, the 40th president. The reason I became a Republican was because of Ronald Reagan, so I have great affection and affinity, but he used to say he envisioned a shining city with tall walls but large doors, welcoming anyone who had the courage and the willingness to come here. We've got to fix the doors, even at the same time that we're securing the border, but it'll just take leadership to do it. But I believe we'll produce that leadership, because I think the American people understand that this is we're a nation of immigrants. And apart from our Native American brothers and sisters and their progeny, all of our people came from somewhere else. And I think we owe it to this generation and future generations to fix what's broken in our immigration system even while we secure the border of the United States of America.
Dwell on this too long. I just came from Washington, and I come back, I have hope, and then I come back discouraged, with the inaction. Immigration, which is an example of where both parties think we have a problem, let's fix it. And then they go merely their own ways. The Democrats have a position that they think gets them votes. The Republicans think they have a position that gets them votes. And consequently, re-election becomes more important than solving the problem. If you're the president, so that happens, what would you do to, in fact, lead and bring them together to solve problems? How would you go about it?
Well, I've said sometimes that a few times during my years in Congress, we felt the gale force wind of do something. Because I tell you, the most powerful force in Washington, D.C. is all of you. When the American people say do something, Congress and administrations generally step up and figure it out. And so for me, it honestly begins with creating leadership that will explain to the American people, whether it's the issue of immigration and our broken borders and our broken system, or whether it's the issue of our national debt crisis or our challenges. You begin by explaining to the American people where we're at. I honestly think that a careful study of American history proves that the American people have a demonstrated capacity to do hard things, as long as they have leaders that are straight with them about the truth and bring creative solutions to that. Now, on this immigration issue, I'm not really new to this fight. I'm pretty sure that's Ernest Istook sitting back there. We served a lot of years in Congress, and I want to thank you for your service. He's my great friend. But he remembers this. It was back in 2006. I was the chairman of the House Conservative Caucus. It's in my book. I don't know if you... but I wrote about it. I had a proposal for immigration reform that would capture the power of the private marketplace. We essentially said, the Democrats years earlier had shut down a guest worker program. The labor unions pushed them in the 1960s to shut it down. And that was when illegal immigration really shot through the roof. The old Bracera system, not to belabor it, but you know about it, the old Bracera system allowed people to come into the country and do work in agriculture, do work in construction, but then go home. Oftentimes go home seasonally. And it was an orderly system. The labor unions didn't like it, so Lyndon Johnson shut it down. Illegal immigration started to become a problem. And it's never relented, it never stopped. So I had a little old lady, a rancher, come into my office when I was in Congress. And she said, how about we reintroduce a guest worker program? Right after you get border security, internal enforcement, everything that you want to do to uphold the rule of law. But she said, how about we have a guest worker system that's run by the private sector, right? That companies like Kelly Services and Monster.com would run a program, employment placement program, that would be overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. And I have to tell you, it was something that our colleagues in Congress had a great interest in, and President Bush took a great interest in it. Although I didn't support amnesty, and the president did, that was how I got to the Oval Office, because he was interested that I was offering a solution. Senator Phil Gramm said famously years ago, there's no problem too big or too complex in this country that can't be solved if somebody can make a buck solving it. Okay? So I just thought, harness the power of the private sector to solve this problem, right? But as you said, Gary, it got caught up in politics. That year we ended up losing the majority, and Democrats, you remember the Democrats under Barack Obama controlled the House and the Senate. The White House never did a thing to fix a broken immigration system, let alone secure the border. So I really do believe that there are ideas like that out there, innovative ideas that begin with law and order, but then can move into harnessing the power of the private sector. We can solve this problem. We're Americans. And I believe we can solve it in a way that will result in a boundless economic future for our country.
Thank you. Let's talk about the future.
Yeah. Gee, look at the time.
Get your crystal ball out. What is the future of the GOP? We seem to be divided inside the party. President Reagan, again, to invoke him and his common sense approach, he said, if you agree with me 80% of the time, you're my friend. We end up having extremes in both parties, and we're losing our young people. We have Republicans who are becoming now independents, unaffiliated. We have probably the same thing happening with the Democrat Party. What about our young people? The reason I got involved in the Institute is to see what we could do to help our young people become civically minded and civically involved.
Can we give him a round of applause for that?
What do you think we should be doing? Our young people are being attracted to socialism, they're attracted to anyism, and dropping out of engagement. They complain a lot, but they're not doing things. So the future is our young people. What would you do as president to bring that about?
Well, I was just at the University of North Carolina the night before last. I was speaking to about 1,000 kids. I've spoken at Stanford, and almost everybody stayed. I spoke at Georgetown, I spoke at the University of Virginia, University of Alabama a couple weeks back. In the last 2 years, we've had the opportunity to travel with a great group called Young America's Foundation that does what the Herbert Institute does. But they provide conservative speakers around the country. And I have to tell you, I'm so inspired by this generation. I'm absolutely convinced that young Americans today are the freedom generation. I mean, look, Bernie Sanders lost the nomination in the last election, but he won the party, right? I mean, the Democratic Party today has been overtaken by Bernie Sanders-style socialism and the politics of the radical left. It's that notion of a command and control economy, of a limited freedom, of dictating how people live and work and worship. That's the radical left's agenda. I don't think this generation is going to put up with that. I mean, this is a generation that's grown up with the whole world at their fingertips, right? I mean, you and I, the world's changed a lot since you and I were growing up. I tell kids this when I'm on campuses. I say, you know, when I was growing up, if I heard a song that I liked on the radio, you know, I'd try and remember the name of it, and then I'd go to the record store after school and thumb through the records and see if I could find the record. It's a small example, but it's a good one. Now, I don't even know all the different apps, but I mean, you hear a song you like, just click, 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 I own it, right? And you can't tell me that the generation that has grown accustomed to that kind of consumer choice, that kind of flow of information, is going to put up with socialism. This is a freedom generation. And we just got to take the message of freedom to them and engage them on behalf of freedom. And I think they'll find it.
Me too, you know. I think people are a little bit ignorant. We need to make sure that they're not ignorant and have no opportunity to choose the right. Coin phrase. There you go. But, so
today is the first day you've ever been to the left of me. I think it will.
So, let's talk about the social issues.
Yeah.
You know, what do we do about those, Ronald Reagan used to call those, we need to have the safety net there to help them. Those impoverished, how are we going to lift them out of poverty? What about health care for everybody? How's the Affordable Care Act working out, do you think? And what would you do on those social issues if you were the leader of the band?
Well, I bring free market principles to all of it. One of the things I know that Republicans in the House just passed a measure to deal with the debt ceiling. It included some initial steps toward fiscal discipline, and one of them was work requirements in Medicaid and welfare for able-bodied adults without dependents. Simple idea, but there's those kind of reforms, things you've done here with with waivers from the federal government that improve people's lives as well. I think we got to make sure that welfare is a safety net and not a web. That it's an opportunity for people to, when they're down on their luck, that it creates a threshold for them and for vulnerable families, but that it also creates the incentives for people to return to the workforce to improve themselves. In the area of healthcare, I will tell you that the state of Indiana, we were the first state in the country to implement health savings accounts in a Medicaid program. And what we did is people could get a credit for what they put, if you're familiar with the health savings account. Many people are. In Indiana, though, people would get a credit for weight loss, for quitting smoking, for engaging in wellness and other decisions, and it improves their lives. If you want to reduce the cost of healthcare in America, let's create systems that encourage people to have healthy living, right? Create incentives for that in a marketplace of ideas. But I truly do believe that we've got to make sure that the big government welfare state programs, Obamacare has been a complete disaster for millions of Americans. That we create innovative, market-based solutions in healthcare, and then when it comes to welfare, that we really focus at the point of the need, that people that are truly vulnerable and truly need public assistance, but that we create pathways for people to move from welfare to work. Under our administration, with waivers that we distributed to states around the country, there was an incredible season of innovation. And we moved, in those first 3 years, we moved 10 million people from welfare to work in this country. It can be done with right principles and the right leadership in Washington, D.C. and in state houses around America.
A recent Pew poll talked about Americans feeling increasingly pessimistic about the future, whether that's our standing in the world, international position, whether it's the economy is going to fail, the debt you've already talked about. What should be done to give people hope for the future, and why should we be optimistic about the future?
Well, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. But it's not based upon my opinion of the American government. As Gary kindly mentioned, and as I mentioned in my book, I've served in Washington, D.C., I've served at the state level. I will tell you, over the last 20 years of service, my opinion of the federal government has gone down. The capacities of our national government. But my opinion of the American people has gone up every day. I mean, during my time in Congress, traveling downrange to visit soldiers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, when I was governor of Indiana during flooding and tornadoes, seeing the way total strangers would show up in the front yard of a devastated home, help people rebuild their lives, people they would literally never see again. They pour their hearts and souls into. And then during our season of service, the same as Karen and I would travel to places, natural disasters, wildfires and hurricanes. I mean, I've seen the compassion, the generosity, the kindness, the idealism of the American people every day through all those years of service. The challenge we have, we just got to have government as good as our people. And I believe someday soon we will. Have government that's just as creative, innovative, forward-looking, compassionate, generous as the American people. It's just going to take all of us to make sure that happens.
It's come to my attention, correct me if this is wrong, but you had an interview yesterday, and I had some questions asked of you. Can you tell us about that interview? If not, tell us about January 6th.
Well, I'm actually very limited to speak about anything pertaining to grand jury deliberations for reasons that you understand. But if people are curious about what I might say, you look at the interviews that I've done over the last 6 months, and you can read the pages of that book. Because it's the truth. Now, January 6th was a tragic day. But thanks to the courage of law enforcement, violence was quelled. Members of both parties returned to the Capitol the very same day. And I believe a day of tragedy became a triumph of freedom because our institutions held. And I will always believe, by God's grace, with my wife at my side the whole day and the whole night, and our daughter beside her, I'll always believe, by God's grace, that we did our duty that day under the Constitution of the United States of America. But I have to tell you, my favorite word you've used so far is future. I think of that Bible verse that says, forgetting what is behind, straining toward what is ahead. And I think that for the Republican Party, we would do well to focus on the future. Elections are always about the future. In fact, I believe in those recent midterm elections, candidates that were focused on the future, focused on the challenges that the American people are facing at home and abroad under the failed policies of the Biden administration, did very well. The candidates that were focused on the past, that were focused on relitigating the past, did not fare as well. So I really believe the key for our party going forward, in many ways the key for our nation going forward, is let's learn the lessons from hard days in the past. Let's learn the lessons that we learned in the course of the worst pandemic in 100 years. Let's learn the lessons of policies and practices in an ever more challenging world stage. But let's focus on the future. And let's do everything we can to convince our kids that they live in the greatest nation on earth. And there's nothing the American people can't accomplish if we will stand firmly on the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, and ultimately if we will keep faith with Him who has ever guided this miracle of democracy since its very founding. Because God is not done with America yet. And I believe if we will turn our hearts back to Him, the best days for the greatest nation on earth are yet to come. Amen.